Well, good afternoon. I'll be talking today about economics and how the economics of the Western Hemisphere, specifically the United States, affect the American church. I just want to go ahead and begin with kind of an overview of poverty and wealth, and then look into the dynamics of how that plays itself out within the church, individually, corporately, and how its greatest assets and also its greatest threats to the church as well, and how we can be redemptive in those places. So getting started, the poverty rate is about 12.3% of Americans. So roughly around 40 million, so 39.7 million Americans suffer or are under the poverty rate, considered impoverished, as it were. 18.5 million of them live in deep poverty, which is in household income below 50% of poverty threshold. And I was doing some research, and the major poverty thresholds as of 2018, of course, differ depending on social and economical status, married or not, different variables. But the big three here is 12,000 a year for a single person under 65, 16,500 for two people with no children, right, married with no children, and then 25,000 for a family of four with two children under 18, and that's what's considered poverty line. Now, 18.5 million of those people live in deep poverty, live in half of that income a year. And so I wanted to give an overview of what these categories are. I looked this up in the Federal Bureau, the census, and it's interesting because we always hear about how the middle class is shrinking, but what we see here is that there's a ton of people who fall into this middle class category. These three factors of financial range here. You have low income households, so people who make 45,000 or less a year. The middle class, right? The middle income household is 45,000 to 135,000. That's a huge range. It's $90,000 in between. And then you have the upper income household, so greater than $135,000 a year. Wanted to look into a little bit of where the poverty and how race and poverty coexist. And so not only did I want to show certain ethnicity, but I also wanted to show the percentage of that poverty threshold. You have 9% of white Americans are impoverished, 22% of black Americans, 20% categorized as Hispanic, and then all other ethnicities are in the 13th percentile. It's absolutely staggering. I also wanted to look at the dynamics between poverty and gender, and how this has played itself out not only recently but over the last couple decades. The survey that they've done over the last 30 years is that women have had higher rates of poverty and hardship over men. I mean, it makes sense. It shouldn't be this way, right? But it makes sense thinking about 60 years ago when we didn't even have women in the workforce, right? So there's still a lot of work to be done here. You have 12.1% of women that are under the poverty line and 8.6% of men under the poverty line. So you have this dynamic where there's more women suffering from poverty than there are men, and the different dynamics that go along with that, not only in caregiving, but also in just applying for jobs and things of that nature. So I mean, there's a lot of different factors that go into that, but it was staggering. And the thing is that over the last 30 years, that dynamic of 12 to 8%, that 4% difference is off and on between 4 to 6%, but it's been consistent over the last 30 years. And the same holds true in deep poverty, that there is more women in deep poverty than there are men. Also, I want to flip the switch here to a study of wealth, because you can't have one without the other, right? So we have poverty and we also have wealth. So wealth, it was interesting. Wealth is, especially among millennials, it's defined by experiences other than money, which was kind of hopeful for me. It's like, okay, wow, people actually feel like they're wealthy other than money, which is a great thing. Interesting statistic here is that 49% of Americans feel wealth is saved over time. As though there's this consistent building, consistent saving, consistent putting away to become wealthy at the end. But back to the experiences, 28% of people say wealth comes from living stress-free. 18% say being able to afford everything they want. And then 17% say loving relationships with friends and family are what they really consider wealth to be. Interesting tidbit here. I'm talking about greed versus wealth and contentment, right? Surveys have shown that people believe, just asked a random number across the board, the median number that people believe in order to be, quote, financially comfortable is $1.4 million. Now, we just saw all that, what is considered to be an upper income, right? The dynamics of having $1.4 million, even put away over a lifetime, is extremely hard in this country. And then even considered to be truly wealthy is people going over $2.4 million. It's just the conceptualization versus actuality or reality, like expectation versus reality dynamic here is absolutely phenomenal. Like you see the expectation, right? This going after, we need so much money. I need to have 7 figures before I can feel financially comfortable. Whereas that God continues to provide everything that is good for us. And even when we make 6 figures, it's not enough. And that's where I found that's extremely striking. And so that brings me to my greatest threats. The greatest threats to the church is the economical divide within our culture plays itself out within the church. You have those people who heck, we have churches that are still segregated. And the segregation of wealth comes with that. And resources. And all of those things. But even within multi-ethnic groups, multi-generational groups of churches, you still have this economical divide. You have the have and the have-nots. And what you see, and one of the biggest threats to leadership here is playing favorites to people who give the church more money. And people can pick up on that. You have to be very careful to not play favorites, no matter who gives and no matter how much they give. Something interesting also I wanted to pang out is the factions. It creates factions. It creates cliques of people, right? It creates division within the church, the have and the have-nots. We have to be very careful not to allow our church to fall into this. Also, the conversation about numbers within a multi-ethnic and multi-generational church can also, even between churches, it can also bring not only pride, the sin of pride, but it can also bring jealousy. As if I'm struggling, one of the temptations is I'm going to be jealous of my neighbor who's making so much more money than me. Also, right, Paul talks about learning how to be content in all things. One of the greatest threats is that we won't be content with all things. We won't be content with the money. Now, I'm not talking about living in poverty and not getting what we need. I'm talking about being content with what we have if it's enough. And then also the greatest threat of them all is that the money is the root of all evil. And so the question is how can we be redemptive? How can God use us to be redemptive in these ways? First, there's a biblical backing and mandate for serving the poor. It takes, not only in the Old Testament, but New Testament well across the board, is that we have to take care of the poor and the sick and the needy. Second, there's a biblical call to be good stewards of what is given to us in the first place. Third, and I emphasize this yet again, is that there's a biblical demand to not be lovers of money. And so the church needs to come together to intentionally take care of the poor, the sick, and the needy in the community, to give to those who need, and to take care. Use the resources we have to take care of those who are literally struggling to get by every day, who don't know where their next meal is going to come from, who don't know how they're going to make ends meet in order to feed their kids, whether or not to put clothes in the back or feed the kids, right? We have that question of, Lord, when have we seen you naked? When did we see you hungry? When did we see you in need? It says, even though you've done it for the least of these, you've done it unto me. And so there's redemption in that. The church needs to be there, searching and seeking out those who need our help. Thank you very much. I hope this has brought some kind of insight into this. I look forward to hearing your comments in return.